Hello, welcome. The angel told them, "Flee for your lives, don't look back." Why did the Lot's wife look back? In the moments when the past pulls strongly and the call to move forward feels difficult, the story of Lot's wife stands as a clear warning. As fire and sulfur fell on Sodom and Gomorrah, she looked back and became a pillar of salt. Jesus later said to remember her. The account reveals attachment to worldly possessions that held her heart, the cost of disobedience to clear instructions and doubt in God's protection, the danger of misplaced concern for others left behind, and the pull of simple human curiosity that proved fatal. You may feel similar tensions in your own life, places where letting go of familiar comforts or past securities feels heavy. These narratives invite you into the urgent escape with care, showing the tenderness of God's rescue alongside the seriousness of full obedience. The family moved quickly through the plain, the angels leading them by the hand, the command ringing clear, "Do not look back." Lot's wife walked among them until that decisive glance. The pillar remained as lasting testimony. Listen as the events unfold, offering rest in the call to release what binds and trust completely in the one who delivers. The city she was leaving. To understand what Lot's wife turned back toward, you need to understand what Sodom had been for her. It was not a place she had merely tolerated. It was home, the full, accumulated, deeply textured home of a woman who had built her life inside its walls. The house where she had raised her daughters, the relationships woven through years of shared meals and neighborly familiarity. The social standing that came with being the wife of a man who sat at the city's gate, a position of recognized prominence in the community's civic life. The comforts that Sodom's prosperity had provided, its markets, its networks, its rhythms, the quiet ease of a life that had been organized and furnished and made familiar across years of inhabiting the same place. The angels had called it corrupt. The outcry against it had reached heaven with sufficient force that God had sent the angels to verify what he had heard. The men of the city had demonstrated the previous evening exactly the quality of the corruption, surrounding Lot's house and demanding access to the visitors in ways that left no ambiguity about what Sodom was or what its inhabitants had become. The city was being destroyed for reasons that were neither arbitrary nor disproportionate. And yet, it was her home. The evil had grown up around her, and with her, and in some dimensions probably through her, and the familiarity of it had made it ordinary, and the ordinariness of it had made it comfortable, and the comfort of it had made it something that the command to flee without looking back was asking her to release entirely and immediately and without a backward glance. This is the precise weight of what her turning revealed. The angels had come the evening before, and the morning had arrived with urgency. Lot had lingered. He too was reluctant, his roots in the city deeper than the urgency of the divine warning immediately dislodged. And the angels had physically grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, and had led them out. The Lord was merciful to them. The text records this detail with a care that suggests the leading out was itself an act of grace. A God who did not simply issue the warning and wait to see who would respond, but who reached down and took hold of hands that were not moving quickly enough on their own. They fled. The family of Lot moving across the plain toward Zoar as the sky above Sodom was changing into something that would have been visible even without turning to look. The quality of the light, the smell of what was coming, the sounds that sulfur and fire make when they fall from heaven onto a city. The instruction had been precise. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. The command was not ambiguous, and its source was not uncertain. The angels who had delivered it had just demonstrated their authority to deliver it by pulling the family physically out of the city by their hands. This was not a suggestion offered for consideration. It was the condition of survival. Lot's wife walked with her family. She walked through the plain with the destruction beginning behind her, with the city she had lived in and loved in and built her life inside, going up in the fire that God had sent down on what it had become. She walked forward with everything that was behind her, pulling at something inside her that the walking forward could not fully dislodge. And she turned. What the turning was her backward glance was not simple curiosity. This is the most important thing to understand about the gesture that the text records so briefly, and that Jesus would reference centuries later as a warning for the ages. Curiosity would have been understandable. The human instinct to look at something dramatic and overwhelming is nearly impossible to suppress, and the destruction of an entire city would have been something that every natural impulse would have wanted to witness. But the text does not frame her turning as the reflexive response of someone startled by sound or light. It frames it as the expression of the direction of her heart, a heart that had not fully left the city even as her feet were moving away from it. She looked back because she loved what she was leaving. The corrupt lifestyle, the material comforts, the social world, the life that Sodom had given her and that she had given herself to in return. She could not let go of it entirely. The command had been clear. The mercy that led her out had been real. And in the moment of looking back, she demonstrated that the walking away from Sodom had not required the abandonment of Sodom that genuine escape required. The attachment to what God was judging was stronger in that moment than her obedience to the command that would have preserved her. She became a pillar of salt. The image is stark and strange and carefully chosen. In the ancient Near East, salt was not only a preservative and a seasoning, it was also the substance with which conquered fields were sown to render them permanently barren, a judgment applied to land that was meant to ensure that nothing would grow there again. To sow a field with salt was to declare it finished, its productive capacity permanently ended, its future foreclosed. The ruins of certain defeated cities were ceremonially salted as a declaration that they would not rise again. The pillar of salt that Lot's wife became was the embodiment of this symbolism in a human form. She was not simply killed by the disaster. She was frozen, preserved in the moment of her rebellion, turned into a monument of the judgment she had chosen by the direction of her gaze. Permanent, barren, still. A figure standing on the plain outside a destroyed city, facing backward, made into the very substance that represented permanent judgment and spiritual death. She had looked back at what God was judging, and she had become the image of what looking back at God's judgment produces, not life preserved, but life terminated in the posture of its refusal to leave what God had declared finished. The pillar was visible. The rabbinical tradition held that it stood on the plain for generations, a reminder that could be seen by anyone traveling the road past the ruins of what Sodom had been. Whether or not this is historically verifiable, the theological purpose of the image is clear. The turning was meant to be seen, to be remembered, to serve as the concrete embodiment of the warning that the story was designed to carry forward. What Jesus said about her, centuries later, in the middle of a teaching about the coming of the Son of Man, Jesus paused and said 3 words: "Remember Lot's wife." The context was clear. He was describing the conditions of crisis that would surround his return, conditions in which the decisive, unhesitating abandonment of worldly attachments would be the difference between salvation and the fate of those who could not let go. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let the one who is in the field not turn back. And then, remember Lot's wife. He did not elaborate. The story was too well known to require elaboration. Every person in his audience knew the story of Lot's wife. What they needed was not a retelling, but a redirection, the pointed application of a story they already knew to the crisis they needed to understand they were living in. Remember Lot's wife. Remember what her backward glance revealed about the condition of her heart. Remember that the command to flee without looking back was not cruelty, but mercy. That the city behind them was already destroyed in the divine accounting even before the fire fell, and that the only life available was the life in the direction of the angels pointing, and that the looking back was not a minor spiritual infraction, but the expression of a love for what God was judging that was finally and fatally incompatible with the survival God was offering. The warning Jesus issued was not primarily about Lot's wife. It was about every person who, in the moment of spiritual crisis, looks backward toward the life that God is calling them to leave, who hesitates at the edge of the plain, whose feet are moving forward, but whose heart is still in the city. The backward look costs everything. It costs what it cost Lot's wife, not because God is merciless, but because the attachment it expresses is incompatible with the life being offered in the other direction. The story of Lot's wife is brief in Genesis and almost unbearably sad. A woman who came within the full measure of God's mercy, whose hands were literally grasped by angels and led toward life, who made it to the plain outside the city before the moment of her turning. She was so close. The distance between her and Zoar at the moment she turned was the distance between her and survival. And she turned. The story does not moralize beyond the fact of what happened. It does not explain her motivations or condemn her character or offer a theology of her fate. It simply records, she looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And Jesus said, remember her, not as an exercise in historical curiosity, as the living warning of what happens when the heart's attachment to the life God is judging outweighs the soul's response to the mercy God is extending. As the permanent, visible, standing reminder that the command to not look back is not an arbitrary restriction, but the condition of the life being offered, that the direction of the gaze in the moment of spiritual crisis reveals the direction of the heart. The plain outside Sodom is long gone. The pillar of salt has dissolved into the landscape of history. The warning it embodies has not. Remember Lot's wife, and do not look back. The story of Lot's wife unfolded in one of the most geographically and theologically significant landscapes in the ancient Near East, the region surrounding what is now the Dead Sea, a body of water so saturated with minerals that nothing lives in it, that its shores are crusted with salt formations, that the landscape around it carries the desolate quality of a place that has been permanently altered by something that happened there. The ancient world understood this landscape as the visible, ongoing consequence of what God had done to Sodom and its neighboring cities. The barrenness was not merely geological, it was memorial, the land itself bearing witness to the judgment that had fallen, the salt and the desolation of the Dead Sea region, serving as the permanent, visible reminder of what had once stood there and what it had become. Sodom's wickedness was not a private matter in the ancient imagination. It was the defining example of corruption so thorough that divine judgment became the only available response. The prophets returned to it repeatedly as the benchmark of judgment. You will be like Sodom was among the most severe things a prophet could say to a nation that had departed from faithfulness. Jesus himself used it as the measure of judgment, suggesting that cities that rejected the gospel would face a consequence more severe than what Sodom had received. To live in Sodom, as Lot's wife had lived, was to have been formed by this culture, to have had one's daily life, social networks, material comforts, and sense of belonging built inside a community whose corruption had reached the point of divine judgment. The familiarity of that life was real. The attachment to it was real. The difficulty of leaving it was not moral weakness in isolation. It was the difficulty of a person being asked to walk away from everything that had given their life its shape and its texture and its social meaning. The instruction the angels gave was unambiguous. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. The clarity of the command left no room for graduated compliance or thoughtful negotiation about which elements of it were strictly necessary. The command was total because the situation was total. God's judgment on Sodom was complete and comprehensive, and the condition of survival was the equally complete and comprehensive turn away from it. What Lot's wife's turning back revealed was not primarily that she had violated a rule. It revealed the state of her heart at the moment the rule required its fullest expression. Obedience to the command of the angels required not merely the physical movement of her feet away from Sodom, but the internal release of her attachment to what Sodom had been for her. The command tested what the movement of her feet could not by themselves demonstrate, whether she had left Sodom or whether Sodom had not yet fully left her. The theological tradition surrounding this passage has consistently identified multiple dimensions of what her backward look expressed. There was the attachment to possessions, the houses, the goods, the accumulated material life of a prosperous woman in a prosperous city. There was the social attachment, the daughters who remained, the relationships, the community that Sodom had been the frame for. There was the doubt about God's deliverance, the implicit question expressed in the turning of whether what lay behind was truly finished and whether what lay ahead was truly sufficient to replace it. And there was the disobedience itself, the direct contradiction of an explicit command from divine messengers who had been demonstrated the previous evening to have the authority they carried. All of these dimensions converged in a single gesture. Salt as theological symbol. The form of her judgment was not incidental. She became a pillar of salt, and in the ancient world, salt carried a theological and agricultural weight that the modern familiarity with it as a seasoning tends to obscure. Salt was used in the ancient Near East to destroy the agricultural productivity of conquered land. When a city was thoroughly defeated and the conqueror wished to declare the judgment permanent, to ensure that what had stood there would not rise again, the fields were sown with salt. The salting was the declaration of barrenness, the pronouncement that this ground was finished, that nothing would grow from it, that the life it had previously supported was permanently ended. Lot's wife became the embodiment of this symbol in human form. She was not simply killed. She was preserved in the moment of her turning, frozen in the posture of her attachment to what God had judged, made permanent in the instant of her rebellion. A pillar of salt, barren, static, turned toward destruction, preserved in judgment. The substance that made fields permanently unproductive became the substance of a woman who had made herself permanently unable to receive the life God was offering by looking back toward the life God was ending. The ancient rabbinic tradition held that the pillar stood on the plain for generations, visible to travelers, a geographic sermon preached to everyone who passed the route between the southern hills and the Dead Sea region. Whether historically verifiable or not, the theological function was clear. The judgment was meant to be seen. The warning was meant to be preserved. The posture of looking back was meant to be visible in its consequences to everyone who might be tempted to replicate it. Jesus and the three-word warning. When Jesus referenced Lot's wife in Luke 17:32, he reduced the entire story to 3 words. Remember Lot's wife. The context was his teaching about the coming of the Son of Man, a teaching about the decisive, irreversible quality of the final judgment and the conditions of survival within it. He was describing a moment in which the ordinary rhythms of life would be interrupted by something that required immediate, complete, unhesitating response. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop not come down to take his goods out of his house, and likewise let the one who is in the field not turn back. And then, remember Lot's wife. He did not elaborate. The story needed no elaboration for the people he was addressing. What they needed was the application, the redirection of a story they already knew toward the situation they needed to understand they were inhabiting. The plain outside Sodom was not the only place where the command to not look back would be issued. The coming of the Son of Man would require the same decisive release of worldly attachment that the angels had required of Lot's family on the plain. The early Christian communities that received and transmitted this teaching understood it to apply not only to the final judgment, but to every moment of spiritual crisis that required the decisive abandonment of the old life, the moment of conversion, the moment of calling, the moment when God's invitation required the release of what had previously organized the life being offered in response. Remember Lot's wife became shorthand for the entire warning. The direction of the gaze reveals the direction of the heart, and the heart that looks back toward what God is judging demonstrates, in the looking, an attachment that is finally incompatible with the life being offered in the other direction. The pillar still stands as a monument in the memory of the tradition, even if the physical salt has long since dissolved into the landscape. The warning it embodies has not dissolved, and Jesus said to remember it. Lot's wife was not a weak person in the ordinary sense. She was a person in the grip of one of the most powerful and least examined forces in human psychology, the attachment to the familiar. The research on attachment and loss consistently demonstrates that human beings do not simply leave familiar environments, they carry them. The neural architecture of a life built in a particular place, around particular people, within particular social rhythms and material comforts, is not dismantled by the physical act of departure. The house that the body walks away from remains present in the mind with a vividness and an emotional weight that can, in the acute moments of transition, feel stronger than the reality of the new direction being entered. Lot's wife had built her life in Sodom, not abstractly, concretely, with the full investment of years. The home, the daughters, the social networks, the material accumulation, the familiar rhythms of a life that had its own texture and its own warmth, however corrupt the city surrounding it had become. The corruption had grown up around her and alongside her, and in some dimensions through her, and the familiarity of it had made it ordinary, and the ordinariness of it had made it feel like simply life rather than like a compromised version of it. The command to flee without looking back was asking her to do something that the psychology of attachment makes extraordinarily difficult: to release not just the physical location, but the emotional reality of everything that location had meant. To let go entirely, immediately, and without the backward verification that what was being left was truly gone. Trust faltering under pressure. The backward glance expressed something that preceded the glance itself, a faltering of trust at the precise moment that trust was most urgently required. The angels had physically grasped her hands and led her out. The demonstration of divine authority and divine mercy had been as concrete and personal as anything she would ever experience. The command was clear. The reason for the command was visible in the sky above Sodom. And in the moment when all of this was present, when the evidence for trust was at its most immediate and most undeniable, she turned. This is one of the most psychologically honest details in the entire story. The faltering of trust does not typically happen in the absence of evidence for the trustworthy party. It happens in the presence of competing emotional claims that feel more immediately real than the evidence. The city behind her was the accumulated reality of her life. The command ahead of her was asking her to release that reality for something she could not yet see or feel or hold, in the same way she could feel the pull of what she was leaving. Curiosity is the name often given to what she experienced in that moment. But curiosity is too mild a word. What she experienced was the overwhelming pull of unresolved attachment in a moment of acute transition, the psychological experience of a person who has not yet internally completed the departure that their body has externally begun. Modern psychology has extensively documented what happens to people who cannot complete the process of leaving what needs to be left, who remain, in the language of grief research, stuck in the moment of transition without moving through it. The person who cannot release the past does not simply carry it. They are organized by it. Their present experience is filtered through the lens of what was. Their future is evaluated against what could have been preserved, and the available life being offered in the new direction is perpetually obscured by the backward gaze toward the old one. Lot's wife became a pillar of salt, frozen in the moment of her turning, preserved in the posture of her attachment. The physical image is the precise psychological portrait of the person who has given the past the final authority over the present. Static, fixed in place, unable to move forward because the backward pull has become the permanent orientation. The freedom that Lot and his daughters experienced in reaching Zoar, incomplete, complicated, a new life that carried its own difficulties, was the freedom of people who had kept moving. The mercy extended to them was received by them precisely because they did not stop to verify whether it was worth receiving. The contrast the story implies is the psychological contrast between the person who releases and the person who holds on. The family members who kept moving, who did not turn, who let the city behind them be finished without their backward confirmation that it was finished, entered the new direction with the hard-won freedom of people who had genuinely left what they had left. The grief of the leaving was real. The loss was real. The new life was not immediately comfortable or even clearly good, but they were moving, and the movement itself was the form that trust took in the moment when trust was most required. Jesus' instruction, "Remember Lot's wife," was the invitation to examine where in our own lives the backward gaze is operating, where the attachment to the familiar past is stronger than the trust in the direction God is pointing, where the leaving has been physically begun but not internally completed, where the salt of spiritual stagnation is forming in the place where forward movement was always meant to continue. The command is still what it was on the plain outside Sodom: do not look back. Not because the past was not real, because the life being offered is in the other direction, and the looking back confirms an attachment that is incompatible with receiving it. The immediate and permanent cost. The most striking feature of the harm that Lot's wife's backward glance produced is its immediacy and its totality. There was no gradual consequence, no warning issued before the judgment arrived, no opportunity to recognize the error and correct the direction. She turned, and she became a pillar of salt, and the becoming was simultaneous with the turning, the consequence expressing itself in the same moment as the choice that produced it. This immediacy was not cruelty. It was the precise expression of what the situation required and what the looking back revealed about the condition of her heart in that decisive moment. The family was on the plain between a city under judgment and the place of safety that divine mercy was leading them toward. The margin for the backward gaze in this context was zero, not because God was merciless, but because the nature of the escape made the backward orientation incompatible with the survival being offered. She could not look back at Sodom and continue toward Zoar simultaneously. The turning was the stopping. The stopping on the plain of Sodom was the end. What she lost was not only her physical life. She lost it in the posture of her attachment, frozen facing backward, preserved in the moment of her rebellion, turned toward the city that was being destroyed rather than toward the life that was being extended. The pillar of salt was not simply a monument to her death. It was the embodiment of her spiritual condition at the moment of her dying, the permanent, visible form of a heart that had not released what God had already judged finished. The harm radiated outward from Lot's wife into the family that continued without her. Lot and his daughters arrived in Zoar as survivors of something that had taken everything else: the extended family, the community, the social world that Sodom had been the frame for, and now the wife and mother whose backward glance had separated her from them on the plain. The trauma of that loss did not simply accompany them into their new life as background difficulty. It shaped the brokenness of what followed: the isolation in the mountains, the compromised decisions made in the absence of the community that had been destroyed, the generational damage that the story in its broader context reveals. The pattern that Lot's wife embodied, the inability to release the past when God's mercy was offering the future, did not only harm the person who embodied it, it reduced the capacity of the family around her to enter the new chapter with the wholeness that the new chapter required. Lot's wife as an individual into every person and community that replicates her pattern. The person who has been called out of something, out of a destructive relationship, out of a pattern of sin that organized their life, out of the comfortable familiarity of a way of being that God has declared insufficient, and who cannot release the backward pull of it, does not simply slow their movement toward what God is offering. They stop. They freeze in the posture of their attachment. The forward life that was available contracts around the fixation on what was left behind, and the available mercy that was leading them toward Zoar is received incompletely because part of them is still on the plain, still turned toward the city, still calculating whether what was behind was truly finished, and whether what is ahead is truly worth the cost of the full release. Salt does not preserve life, it preserves the appearance of what has already ended, and the person frozen in nostalgia for what God has judged is preserved in exactly the same way, present in form, turned toward the past, spiritually barren in the place where forward movement was always meant to continue. Remember Lot's wife. Lot and his daughters kept walking. This simple fact, unremarkable in its statement, extraordinary in its context, is the positive vision the story holds alongside the warning of Lot's wife. On the same plain, at the same moment, under the same rain of sulfur and fire, with the same city burning behind them and the same pull of everything familiar pressing against the forward movement, Lot and his daughters did not turn. They entered Zoar. They received the mercy that the angels had been leading them toward. The contrast the story establishes between the wife who turned and the family members who did not is not a contrast between people of dramatically different spiritual capability. It is a contrast between people making a choice in the same moment under the same conditions, the choice of whether the forward direction or the backward pull would govern the next step. Lot and his daughters chose the forward direction, and the choice, sustained through the plain, brought them through to safety while the city they had left was still burning behind them. This is the transformation the story was always pointing toward. Not the dramatic lightning bolt change of a single moment, but the cumulative, step-by-step, forward-oriented obedience of people who had decided that what God was offering ahead was worth the full release of what they were leaving behind. The grief of the leaving was real. They had lost everything except each other and their lives. The new life in Zoar and then in the mountains was not easy or simple or free from the complications that severe loss and displacement produce. But they were alive. They were in the direction God had pointed. The mercy that had grasped their hands on the doorstep of Sodom had brought them through to the other side. The transformation that complete obedience produced was not the immediate restoration of everything that had been lost. Lot's family arrived in Zoar diminished, without the city, without the extended family, without the material life that Sodom had provided. The new life was smaller and harder and more exposed than the old one, and it was alive. This is what Lot's wife forfeited in the turning, not the comfort of Sodom, which was already finished, but the living, forward, however difficult reality of a life that was still going somewhere. The transformation available through complete obedience is not the promise of an easier life than the one being left. It is the promise of a living one, a life that is moving toward what God is offering, rather than frozen in the posture of what God has already judged. The people who have made the full release, who have obeyed the command without the backward glance, who have walked the plain without turning, consistently describe the same discovery on the other side of the plain, that what God was offering in the forward direction was real, that the mercy extended was sufficient, and that the life available without the backward look was more genuinely alive than the life organized around the comfortable familiarity of what was behind them. The forward step, fully taken, leads somewhere, and the somewhere is the life that the backward glance would have cost them. The first practical step that Lot's wife's story demands is the honest identification of the attachments that would make you turn if the command to leave came tonight. Not vague attachments to comfort in general, the particular ones. The relationship that God has been indicating needs to be released, but whose familiarity makes the release feel like loss too large to sustain. The pattern of behavior that the old life organized itself around, and that the new direction requires leaving behind completely. The material comfort, the social standing, the community identity, the way of being in the world that Sodom had provided, and that the plain between Sodom and Zoar is asking you to walk away from, without verification that what follows will compensate for what was left. Name these things clearly. Write them down if that helps make them concrete rather than vague. The attachment that cannot be named cannot be consciously released, and the attachment that cannot be consciously released will express itself as it expressed itself in Lot's wife, in the moment of crisis when the command requires its fullest obedience. The naming is not the release, but the naming is the beginning of the release. The honest acknowledgement that something has a claim on your backward attention that the forward call of God requires you to relinquish. The practical wisdom embedded in Jesus' warning, "Remember Lot's wife," is that the crisis moment is not the time to learn the forward orientation for the first time. By the time the sulfur is falling, the practiced direction of the heart has already determined which way the head will turn. Practice the forward orientation in the ordinary days before the crisis arrives. Practice releasing daily attachments to comfort and preference, and the familiar management of your own security before the acute moment requires the release of something larger and harder. Practice obeying the Spirit's prompting before the prompting requires everything, so that obedience is a practiced response rather than an untested aspiration when the command comes with the urgency that commands on plains outside burning cities carry. Each small practice of forward trust, Each moment of choosing God's direction over the backward pull of comfortable familiarity is building the character that the crisis will require. Each small refusal of the backward glance in ordinary circumstances is the preparation for the extraordinary circumstance in which the refusal determines everything. Guard against misplaced concern. One dimension of Lot's wife's backward glance was concern for the people she had left behind. Daughters who remained in the city, the extended social world that Sodom had been the frame for. This concern was real and was not in itself wrong. What made it dangerous was allowing it to override the personal obedience that the command required of her. There is a form of misplaced concern that uses the legitimate needs of others as the reason for delaying or abandoning our own forward obedience, that looks back toward what God is calling us to leave under the cover of caring about the people connected to what we are leaving. This concern is not compassion. It is the attachment that has found a socially acceptable form. Guard against it. Your obedience to the forward call is not the abandonment of the people behind you. It is the only form your faithfulness can take in the moment the command requires it. The most useful thing you can be to the people you love is a person who kept walking, who demonstrated by your continued movement that the mercy God was offering was real and worth the full release of everything that pulling backward would have cost you. The final practical application is the one that transforms individual obedience into communal resource. Walk forward in a way that others can see. The family that does not look back when the command comes to move forward becomes the visible testimony that forward movement is possible, that the attachments can be released, that the mercy ahead is sufficient, that the backward pull, however strong, is not the final authority over the direction of a life submitted to God. Your forward walk is someone else's encouragement that the plain can be crossed. The plain outside Sodom has been silent for a very long time. The city is gone. The angels have returned to wherever angels return. The fire has long since burned itself out into the geological desolation that surrounds the Dead Sea still. That barren, salt-saturated landscape that the ancient world read as the permanent visible consequence of what God did there on a single morning when justice could wait no longer. And somewhere on that plain, for the generations that followed, a pillar of salt stood, not as decoration, as witness, the permanent, visible, impossible to ignore reminder of what the backward glance costs, of what happens when the feet move forward but the heart stays behind, when the mercy of God is extended and grasped and then partially refused in the moment the plain required its fullest acceptance. She had been led out by the hands. She had walked the same ground her husband and daughters walked. She had received the same mercy, heard the same command, been given the same personal, angelic guidance toward life. And she turned. The turning was not dramatic. It was a glance, one movement of the head, one redirection of the gaze, one moment in which the attachment to what was behind proved stronger than the trust in what lay ahead. And the glance became her monument. The pillar stood on the plain as the three-word sermon that Jesus would eventually reference by name. Remember Lot's wife, not to condemn her, to warn everyone who would come after her, everyone who would one day stand on their own version of the plain, with the city burning behind them and the angels pointing forward, and the pull of the familiar life exerting its particular, powerful, dangerous claim. Rest well.